March 24, 1945, 30,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. Captain Roscoe Brown squinted through the canopy of his P-51 Mustang, scanning the sky for threats. Below him, a massive formation of American bombers droned toward their target, the heart of the Third Reich. Around him, the distinctive red-tailed fighters of the 332nd Fighter Group maintained their protective formation. Then he saw them, sleek, sinister shapes cutting through the air at impossible speeds. Messerschmitt Me-262s, the world's first operational jet fighters, traveling at 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour, faster than any propeller-driven aircraft could hope to achieve. "Bandits! 12 o'clock high!" Brown called over the radio. "Jets coming in fast!" The German pilots were confident. Their jets were untouchable by American fighters. They'd been told the enemy couldn't catch them, couldn't hurt them. But they hadn't counted on one thing. The men in those red-tailed Mustangs were the best-trained, most motivated fighter pilots in the entire United States Army Air Forces. What happened in the next 3 minutes would make history. Captain Brown would become one of only a handful of pilots to shoot down a German jet in aerial combat. But more importantly, it would be another chapter in the most remarkable story of World War II. How a group of Black Americans, fighting against prejudice at home and fascism abroad, became the most respected fighter group in the entire war. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Men who weren't supposed to exist, flying missions they weren't supposed to survive, proving things that weren't supposed to be possible. Before we dive into their incredible combat record, tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers worldwide who understand that courage has no color and excellence knows no boundaries. Tuskegee, Alabama, 1941. The United States was preparing for war, building the largest military machine in history. But there was one group of Americans explicitly excluded from military aviation: Black citizens. The conventional wisdom, stated openly by military leadership and politicians, was that Black Americans lacked the intelligence, courage, and reflexes necessary for combat aviation. Army Air Corps leaders testified before Congress that African Americans were inherently unsuited for flying fighters. Some called it science. History calls it racism. But pressure was mounting. Civil rights organizations, Black newspapers, and progressive politicians demanded that African Americans be given the chance to serve as pilots. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt personally championed the cause. In September 1940, under political pressure, the War Department announced the formation of an all-Black pursuit squadron. The announcement was met with skepticism from military leadership, outright hostility from many white Americans, and cautious hope from Black communities across the nation. Would this be a genuine opportunity or an elaborate setup for failure? The location chosen for training was deliberate and strategic: Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically Black college founded by Booker T. Washington. Here, far from major cities and northern politicians, the experiment could be conducted quietly. If it failed, as many expected, it could be shut down without much fanfare. The first class of aviation cadets arrived at Tuskegee in July 1941. These weren't random recruits. They were the best and brightest: college graduates, men with private pilot licenses, athletes, scholars. They had to be exceptional just to be considered, while white cadets could be merely competent. Among them was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of the Army's first Black general. Davis had endured 4 years of silence at West Point, where white cadets refused to speak to him except when required by duty. He graduated 35th in a class of 276, became a cavalry officer, and now found himself training to be a pilot in a program most military leaders wanted to fail. The training was deliberately brutal. Instructors, both Black and white, pushed the cadets harder than any comparable white training program. The washout rate was astronomical. Of the first class of 13 cadets, only 5 graduated. The military wanted to prove Black men couldn't fly. The instructors wanted to prove they could, but only if they were extraordinary. Captain Noel Parrish, a white Kentuckian appointed as director of training, understood what was at stake. "These men aren't just training to be pilots," he told his staff. "They're on trial for their entire race. Every mistake will be used as evidence of inferiority. They have to be perfect or this program dies." The cadets trained on Stearman PT-17 biplanes, then advanced to BT-13 Valiants and AT-6 Texans. They learned formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and combat tactics. They studied aerodynamics, meteorology, and aircraft systems. They did it while facing segregation that extended to every aspect of life on base. Black officers couldn't enter the white officers' club. They ate in separate facilities, used separate restrooms, lived in separate barracks. German prisoners of war held at nearby camps had more freedom of movement than black American officers training to fight for their country. Lieutenant Charles DeBow, one of the early graduates, later recalled, "We were fighting two wars, one against the Germans, which we expected, one against our own military, which we shouldn't have had to fight. Every flight, every mission, we knew we were representing millions of people who'd never get this chance. Failure wasn't an option." On March 7, 1942, the first class graduated. 5 men, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., George Roberts, Charles DeBow, Mac Ross, and Lemuel Custis, received their silver wings and became commissioned officers in the United States Army Air Forces. It was a moment of triumph, but also uncertainty. They were pilots without aircraft, officers without assignment, symbols of a program that many in power still hoped would fail. What came next would determine whether this graduation was a beginning or an ending. The 99th Pursuit Squadron, later redesignated the 99th Fighter Squadron, spent months training without a combat assignment. The question hanging over them was simple: would they be allowed to fight, or would they be relegated to support roles and training duties until the war ended? The debate raged in Washington. Some generals argued the squadron should be disbanded, the experiment declared a failure without ever facing combat. Others, including General George Marshall, insisted they deserved their chance. Finally, in April 1943, the decision came. The 99th would deploy to North Africa, joining the combat against German and Italian forces. They would fly the P-40 Warhawk, a capable but aging fighter that required skill and courage to survive in combat. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., now commanding the squadron, gathered his men before departure. His words were reported by multiple sources. "Gentlemen, we're going to war. Some people are sending us hoping we'll fail so they can prove their prejudices right. Others are praying we'll succeed to prove prejudice wrong. We're not going to think about any of that. We're going to do our jobs. We're going to fly our missions. We're going to kill Germans. And we're going to come home. That's all that matters." The 99th arrived in North Africa in June 1943, assigned to the 33rd Fighter Group. The reception was mixed. Some white pilots were curious, others hostile. Most were skeptical. These men had never seen black fighter pilots. The prevailing attitude was, let's see if they can actually fight. Their first combat mission came on June 2, 1943, a coastal patrol near Tunisia. No enemy contact, but the mission was completed successfully. The real test came 2 weeks later during the Allied invasion of Pantelleria, an Italian island fortress. The 99th was assigned to strafe ground targets and provide air cover for landing forces. German and Italian fighters rose to meet them. In the ensuing combat, Lieutenant Charles Hall shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the squadron's first aerial victory. Hall's combat report was clinical and professional. Engaged enemy fighter at 8,000 feet, closed to 200 yards and opened fire, observed strikes on fuselage and wing route. Enemy aircraft rolled inverted and entered vertical dive, confirmed crash by ground observers. But the significance went far beyond one kill. A black American pilot had shot down a German fighter in aerial combat. Something the critics said was impossible had just happened. News of the victory spread quickly. Black newspapers across America ran headlines celebrating the achievement. But in military circles, skepticism remained. One victory didn't prove anything, critics said. Let's see how they perform under sustained combat. The 99th spent the summer and fall of 1943 flying missions over Sicily and Italy. They escorted bombers, strafed ground targets, and engaged in aerial combat. Their performance was adequate, not spectacular, but competent, which frustrated everyone. The white military establishment pointed to their average performance as proof that black pilots were inferior. The black community worried that average wouldn't be enough to save the program, and the pilots themselves felt the immense pressure of representing their race while simply trying to survive combat. Then came September 1943 and the controversy that nearly destroyed everything. Colonel William Momyer, commander of the 33rd Fighter Group, submitted a report to headquarters criticizing the 99th's performance. He claimed they lacked aggressiveness, showed poor formation discipline, and were unsuited for combat operations. He recommended the squadron be withdrawn from combat and relegated to training duties. The report was devastating. It confirmed every prejudice, validated every doubt. News leaked to the press. Headlines questioned whether black pilots could handle combat stress. The program seemed doomed. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was recalled to Washington to defend his squadron before the War Department's Advisory Committee on Negro Troop Policies. His testimony, delivered with quiet intensity, became legendary. "Gentlemen, my men have flown over 500 combat missions. We've lost pilots to flak and enemy fire. We've shot down enemy aircraft. We've completed every assigned mission. Colonel Momier's criticism focuses on aggressiveness and initiative. I would submit that these qualities are products of experience and confidence, not race. Give us the same experience as white squadrons, judge us by the same standards, and we will prove our worth." The committee deliberated. Meanwhile, back in Italy, the 99th continued flying combat missions, knowing their future hung in the balance. The breakthrough came in January 1944 during the Battle of Anzio. The 99th, now assigned to the 79th Fighter Group, was tasked with providing air cover for the beach landings. German aircraft attacked in force, and the squadron rose to meet them. In 2 days of intense combat, January 27th and 28th, the 99th shot down 12 German aircraft without a single loss. Captain Clarence Jameson downed 3 enemy fighters in one mission. The performance was spectacular, undeniable, and perfectly timed. The accusations of timidity evaporated. Combat reports from white bomber crews praised the 99th's aggressive protection. German prisoners interrogated after capture expressed surprise that their attackers had been black Americans. "They fought like demons," one German pilot reportedly said. The crisis had passed. The 99th had proven themselves in the hardest test, sustained combat against a determined enemy. But the real revolution was just beginning. By early 1944, the success of the 99th Fighter Squadron had led to an ambitious expansion. 3 new squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, trained at Tuskegee and prepared for deployment. Combined with the 99th, they would form the 392nd Fighter Group, the first all-black fighter group in American military history. Command went to Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., now a full colonel at age 31. His leadership would prove crucial in what came next. The 332nd deployed to Italy in February 1944, initially equipped with P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks. They flew ground attack missions, bomber escort, and air superiority patrols. But it was when they transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts and later P-51 Mustangs that their legend truly began. The decision to paint the tails of their aircraft bright red served multiple purposes. It allowed easy identification of friendly aircraft, boosted squadron morale, and became a calling card that struck fear into enemy pilots and provided confidence to bomber crews. "There's the red tails," bomber crews would say with relief when they saw the distinctive scarlet markings. "We're going to make it home today." The 332nd adopted an unusual and controversial doctrine under Davis's command: stick with the bombers. While other fighter groups often broke formation to chase German fighters, seeking aerial victories and personal glory, the Red Tails maintained close escort. Their primary mission was protecting bombers, not racking up individual kills. This doctrine drew criticism from some quarters. Fighter pilots wanted aerial victories, the visible proof of combat success. Some white fighter groups had impressive kill tallies because they aggressively pursued enemy aircraft, sometimes leaving bombers vulnerable. Davis was unmoved. Our job is to bring bombers home. Every bomber that returns is a victory. Every crew that survives is a success. We're not here for personal glory. We're here to prove black men can do the job better than anyone else. The results spoke for themselves. Bomber crews began requesting the Red Tails as escorts. Word spread through the 15th Air Force. If you want to come home, pray for the 332nd on your wing. Lieutenant Harold Brown, a white bombardier with the 97th Bomb Group, later testified, "We lost aircraft on almost every mission. Fighters would peel off chasing German planes and we'd get hit. But when those Red Tails showed up, they stayed with us. All the way to target, all the way home. German fighters would approach, see those Red Tails, and break off. They knew those boys would fight to protect us." The statistics became legendary. The 332nd Fighter Group flew over 2,500 bomber escort missions. Of the bombers under their direct escort, only about 25 were lost to enemy fighters. This was the lowest loss rate of any escort fighter group in the 15th Air Force. Compare that to the overall loss rates. 8th Air Force in England lost roughly 5 to 6% of bombers per mission. 15th Air Force in Italy lost 3 to 4%, but bombers escorted by the 332nd lost less than 2% to fighter attack. The Red Tails' reputation grew among both allies and enemies. German pilots learned to recognize the red-tailed Mustangs and approached with caution. These weren't glory-hunting Americans who could be lured away from the bombers. These were disciplined professionals who would engage only to protect their charges. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a German ace with over 20 kills, encountered the Red Tails during a mission to Ploesti in July 1944. His post-war account described the engagement. "We spotted the bombers at 25,000 feet, perfect altitude for attack. Then we saw the escorts, Red Tails, many of them in perfect formation. We tried to draw them off, diving past the bombers to provoke chase. Most American fighters would follow, seeking kills. These didn't move. They maintained position like they were welded to the bombers. We tried to attack anyway. They met us with coordinated fire. Professional, precise, deadly. We lost 2 aircraft and achieved nothing. After that, when we saw Red Tails, we looked for easier targets. But this isn't to say the Tuskegee Airmen didn't achieve aerial victories. They did, spectacularly. The difference was they achieved them while maintaining escort discipline. Lieutenant Lee Archer became one of the group's top aces. His preferred tactic was to wait until German fighters committed to attacking bombers, then strike as they concentrated on their attack runs. The Germans, focused on the heavy bombers, often didn't see the red-tailed Mustang diving on them until it was too late. "They'd line up on a B-17, tunnel vision locked on their target," Archer later explained. "That's when I'd hit them. One burst from my 50s, and they'd disintegrate. Then I'd immediately return to formation. My job wasn't to chase kills across Germany, it was to protect bombers." Archer was officially credited with 4 aerial victories, though post-war analysis suggests the actual number may have been higher. Many of the Tuskegee Airmen's kills went unconfirmed because they refused to break formation to verify crashes, prioritizing mission success over personal recognition. Captain Joseph Ellsbury achieved his 4 kills in a single mission on July 12, 1944. His combat report described the engagement with characteristic modesty. "Engaged 4 enemy fighters attempting to attack bomber formation. Destroyed all 4 in 7 minutes. Returned to escort position, no bombers lost." What the report didn't mention was the skill required to down 4 experienced German pilots in 7 minutes while protecting bombers simultaneously. It was a display of flying ability and tactical genius that would have earned any pilot a distinguished flying cross. Ellsbury received the decoration, though publicity about his achievement was limited by the Army's reluctance to highlight black success. The group's most famous mission came on March 24, 1945, escorting bombers on a 1,600-mile round trip to Berlin. It was the longest escort mission ever flown by the 15th Air Force, pushing the P-51's range to its absolute limit. That's when Captain Roscoe Brown encountered those Messerschmitt Me-262 jets. The jets, traveling at 540 mph, should have been untouchable. But Brown had studied their tactics. Jets were fast in a straight line, but bled energy in turns. They had to slow down to attack effectively. Brown positioned himself between the jets and the bombers, forcing the German pilots to turn to engage. As one Me-262 banked to line up on a bomber, Brown pulled his Mustang into a high G turn that would have blacked out most pilots. At the precise moment when the jet's turn bled its speed advantage, Brown fired. His combat report was matter of fact. Opened fire at 400 yards during target's turn. Observed strikes on fuselage and left engine. Enemy aircraft entered spin and crashed. Pilot did not eject. Brown had done the impossible, shooting down a jet fighter in a propeller-driven aircraft. Two other red-tail pilots, Lieutenant Earl Lane and Lieutenant Charles Brantley, also downed jets that day. The 392nd had achieved something most fighter groups never accomplished. When news reached base, celebration was tempered by professionalism. Yes, they'd shot down jets. Yes, it was historic. But more importantly, all the bombers had returned safely. That was the real victory. The combat achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen were remarkable, but their impact extended far beyond aerial victories and bomber protection. They were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany, another against American prejudice. The segregation they faced was constant and degrading. On base in Italy, facilities were theoretically integrated, but informal segregation persisted. In the United States, during training or on leave, Jim Crow laws enforced brutal discrimination. Captain Leon Roberts recalled an incident in 1944 when returning to the States on leave. I was in uniform, wearing my distinguished flying cross, silver wings, captain's bars. I'd just spent 6 months fighting Germans in Italy. I stopped at a diner in Alabama. They wouldn't serve me. Said they don't serve coloreds. A white captain at the next table, a supply officer who'd never left the States, was eating steak. I'd risked my life for this country, and I couldn't get a hamburger. German prisoners of war were sometimes treated better than black American officers. POWs could eat in restaurants that refused black customers, could sit in waiting rooms where black soldiers couldn't, could use facilities denied to the men who'd captured them. The psychological toll was enormous. These men were flying combat missions, watching friends die, living with constant danger. Then they'd receive letters from home describing lynchings, discrimination, family members abused by Jim Crow laws. They were fighting for a country that didn't treat them as full citizens. Yet they persevered. Why? The answers varied by individual, but common themes emerged in post-war interviews. Lieutenant Colonel Davis explained it simply. We were proving something bigger than ourselves. Every mission we flew successfully, every bomber we brought home, every aerial victory we achieved was evidence against the lie of racial inferiority. We were fighting for our children, our grandchildren, for black Americans who'd come after us. We couldn't quit because we weren't just representing ourselves. First Lieutenant Charles McGee, who would eventually fly 409 combat missions across 3 wars, put it differently. America wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We had family here, history here, roots here. We weren't fighting for the America that was. We were fighting for the America that could be. We believed our service would help create that better nation. The men of the 332nd weren't naive. They understood that military success wouldn't automatically end discrimination, but they believed it would make discrimination harder to justify, would provide evidence of equality that couldn't be dismissed. They were right. By late 1944, the reputation of the Red Tails had spread throughout the military. White bomber crews requested them specifically. White fighter pilots, initially skeptical or hostile, came to respect their professionalism. The evidence of their competence became impossible to ignore. General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., father of the 302nd Commander, visited the group in Italy in 1944. A career Army officer who'd fought discrimination for decades, he was overwhelmed seeing his son command a fighter group and witnessing the respect the unit had earned. "This is what I fought for," he reportedly told his son privately. "Not just that you'd wear the uniform, but that you'd wear it with honor and prove our worth. You've done that. All of you have done that." The psychological warfare aspect was also significant. Nazi propaganda had long claimed that America's racial divisions proved democracy's weakness, that the United States was a hypocritical nation preaching freedom while denying it to black citizens. The Tuskegee Airmen complicated that narrative. Here were black Americans fighting effectively, earning decorations, achieving success. German propaganda struggled to explain how supposedly inferior racial groups were defeating the master race in aerial combat. Some German prisoners, indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology, expressed confusion when captured by or confronting black American pilots. The cognitive dissonance between their ideology and reality was profound. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interviewed after being shot down by Lieutenant Clarence Lester, reportedly asked, "But how? We were told." He couldn't finish the sentence. Reality had shattered propaganda. By war's end, in May 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record was extraordinary by any measure. 578 combat missions flown, 179 bomber escort missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, another 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, over 950 rail cars, trucks, and other vehicles destroyed, 1 destroyer sunk, 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, 8 Purple Hearts. 3 men achieved ace status with 5 or more aerial victories: Joseph Ellsbury, Lee Archer, and Edward Toppins. But the most important statistic was that bomber loss rate. Only about 25 bombers lost to enemy fighters while under their direct escort out of 1,500-plus missions. No other fighter group could match that record. The cost was heavy. The 332nd lost 66 pilots killed in action. Each loss was mourned not just as a personal tragedy, but as a loss to the cause they represented. Second Lieutenant Clarence Jameson's funeral in July 1944, attended by both black and white servicemen, became a symbol of the changing attitudes. A white bomber captain who'd never met Jameson attended and explained to journalists, "That man saved my life twice, chased off German fighters that would have killed me. I don't care what color he was. He was a hero, and I'm here to honor him." The training pipeline at Tuskegee produced 996 pilots during the war, though only about 450 saw combat. The others served as instructors, transport pilots, or arrived too late for deployment. But all had overcome the same barriers, met the same standards, proved the same point. The war's end brought new challenges. What would happen to these men in peacetime? Would the military maintain its black flying units? Would the progress made during war survive into peace? The answer came gradually and incompletely. The military began slowly integrating, though full integration wouldn't come until President Truman's 1948 executive order. Some Tuskegee Airmen continued military careers. Others returned to civilian life, carrying their wartime experiences into the fight for civil rights at home. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. remained in the military, eventually becoming the first black general in the United States Air Force. His career path, from silent cadet at West Point to 4-star general, mirrored the broader changes his generation had fought for. But many others found that wearing a uniform with decorations didn't protect them from discrimination. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson, who'd been shot down and spent time as a POW, returned home to Detroit and was refused service at a restaurant. "I'd been a prisoner of the Germans," he recalled, The Germans treated me better than my own countrymen. The disconnect between military service and civilian reality radicalized some veterans. They'd fought for freedom abroad. Now they demanded it at home. Many became active in the civil rights movement, applying the discipline and courage learned in combat to the fight against segregation. The irony wasn't lost on them. They'd proven they could fly complex aircraft, make split-second tactical decisions, lead men in combat, shoot down enemy fighters. Yet in America, they couldn't vote in many states, couldn't eat at certain restaurants, couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen didn't end in 1945. It continued through decades of civil rights struggle, through changing American attitudes, through the slow recognition of their achievement. In the 1950s and 60s, as the civil rights movement intensified, the Tuskegee Airmen became powerful symbols. Their combat record was evidence that racial prejudice wasn't just wrong morally, it was wrong factually. Black Americans could excel at anything given opportunity and fair treatment. Young civil rights activists pointed to the Red Tails as proof that segregation and discrimination weren't based on capability, but on ideology. If black pilots could protect white bomber crews over Germany, why couldn't black students attend school with white students in Alabama? The argument was compelling and difficult to counter. The Tuskegee Airmen's achievement had created a benchmark of undeniable excellence. Charles McGee, continuing his military career, flew 409 combat missions across World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He retired as a colonel in 1973, having served for 30 years. His career embodied the possibilities that the Tuskegee experience had opened. In 1995, the Air Force commissioned a study of the 332nd Fighter Group's bomber escort record. The study examined combat reports, bomber loss records, and witness testimonies. The conclusion confirmed what bomber crews had known for decades. The Red Tails had the best bomber protection record of any fighter group in the war. The report also debunked a myth that had persisted for years, that the 332nd never lost a bomber under escort. They had lost bombers, about 25 total. But this loss rate was extraordinarily low, far below any comparable unit. The correction of this myth actually strengthened their legacy. The truth, that they lost fewer bombers than any other group while flying more missions, was more impressive than the myth. It showed they were exceptional, not supernatural. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen collectively. Around 300 surviving members attended the ceremony. Many were in their 80s and 90s, but they stood straight, remembered their formations, maintained their dignity. Bush's remarks captured the significance. You risked your lives to make America free, even when America wasn't treating you fairly. You served a country that, at times, didn't serve you back. The victories you won in the sky over Europe helped win a war, but your greater victory came in changing the country you returned to. You proved that courage and skill have no racial boundaries. The surviving airmen received standing ovations. Some wept. All remembered the friends who hadn't lived to see this recognition, the pilots who died proving what should never have needed proof. By 2020, fewer than a dozen original Tuskegee Airmen remained alive. Charles McGee, promoted to Brigadier General in a ceremony just before his death, lived to be 102. He spent his final decades speaking to schools, telling young people, especially young Black Americans, that they could achieve anything. "We didn't think we were special," McGee said in one of his last interviews. "We were just men doing a job, trying to prove we deserved the chance. That's all any of us want. A fair chance to show what we can do. We got that chance and we didn't waste it." What did the Tuskegee Airmen actually prove? The question seems obvious, almost insulting to ask. But it's worth examining because their legacy touches on fundamental truths about capability, prejudice, and human potential. They proved that racial prejudice was factually wrong. Not just morally wrong, which it was, but factually incorrect. The military leadership who'd testified that Black Americans lacked the intelligence, courage, and reflexes for combat aviation were proven wrong by objective evidence. They proved that excellence comes from opportunity plus effort, not from racial genetics. Given the same training, same equipment, and same opportunity as white pilots, Black pilots performed at the same level, often exceeding white units in specific metrics like bomber protection. They proved that prejudice was a weapon that harmed its wielder. The military's initial reluctance to train Black pilots meant wasting potential talent, limiting combat effectiveness, and reducing the available pilot pool. Prejudice didn't protect America, it weakened America. They proved that representation matters. Young Black Americans watching the Red Tails' success saw possibilities they'd never imagined. If Black men could fly fighters, what else was possible? The psychological impact of seeing people who looked like you succeeding in roles previously denied was transformative. They proved that discipline and professionalism could overcome hate. The Tuskegee Airmen faced discrimination, insults, and obstacles throughout their service. They responded not with anger, though anger would have been justified, but with excellence. They let their performance speak. Perhaps most importantly, they proved that change was possible. America in 1941 was deeply segregated, with racial prejudice embedded in law and custom. By 1948, the military was desegregated. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't single-handedly cause this change, but they made it harder to justify maintaining segregation. Their legacy extended beyond aviation and military service. In the decades after the war, their example was cited in legal briefs challenging segregation, in speeches demanding civil rights, in arguments for equal opportunity. When Thurgood Marshall argued Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1954, seeking to end school segregation, he referenced military integration as evidence that segregation wasn't necessary or beneficial. The Tuskegee Airmen had provided real-world proof that integrated service worked. When President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, several Tuskegee Airmen were present. Their service had helped create the moral and legal foundation for this legislation. When Barack Obama was inaugurated as the first Black president in 2009, he invited surviving Tuskegee Airmen to the ceremony. He later said their service had helped make his presidency possible, not directly, but by changing what Americans believed was possible. Today, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen is taught in schools, featured in museums, celebrated in films and books. Their distinctive red-tailed P-51s are among the most recognizable aircraft in aviation history. But beyond the celebration, beyond the well-deserved honor, their story carries lessons still relevant today. That talent is universal, but opportunity is not. The Tuskegee Airmen were exceptional, but they weren't unique. Thousands of other Black Americans could have done what they did if given the chance. That systemic barriers are real and damaging. These men had to be extraordinary just to be considered average. They had to prove their humanity before they could prove their capability. This wasn't fair, and similar barriers persist in different forms today. That excellence is the most powerful form of protest. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't defeat prejudice with anger or violence. They defeated it with competence, with bomber protection rates, with aerial victories, with undeniable achievement. That courage comes in many forms. It took courage to fly combat missions against enemy fighters. It also took courage to face discrimination in uniform, to maintain dignity while being denied basic rights, to persist when everything was designed to make you fail. That individual actions can have collective impact. Every mission flown successfully, every bomber protected, every demonstration of competence chipped away at prejudice's foundations. The cumulative effect of thousands of individual performances created systemic change. The last of the Tuskegee Airmen are passing now, leaving us with memories, records, and lessons. But they also left something more tangible. A blueprint for overcoming injustice through excellence, discipline, and unwavering commitment to proving your worth even when you shouldn't have to. Captain Roscoe Brown, who shot down that Me-262 jet over Berlin in 1945, lived until 2016. In one of his final interviews, he was asked what he wanted people to remember about the Tuskegee Airmen. His answer was simple and profound. Remember that we were just pilots, not black pilots, just pilots. We wanted to serve our country. We wanted to fly. We wanted to prove we belonged in the sky. The fact that we had to prove it at all was the injustice. But we proved it anyway, and in proving it, we helped change America. Not just for black Americans, but for all Americans. We showed that judging people by their character and capability rather than their color made America stronger, not weaker. That lesson, that truth, is what I hope survives us. On any given day, somewhere in America, the roar of restored P-51 engines echoes across airshow crowds. Often, these Mustangs wear the distinctive red tails of the 302nd Fighter Group, a tribute to the men who flew them into history. Children of all backgrounds point at the sky, watching these legendary aircraft perform. They don't know all the details yet, don't understand the full context of segregation and struggle. But they learn that once, men flew these planes into combat, protected bombers, shot down enemy fighters, and changed their country by refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose. The thunder of those Merlin engines carries more than sound. It carries memory, legacy, and proof that excellence cannot be constrained by prejudice. Beyond the statistics and combat reports, the Tuskegee Airmen were individuals with distinct personalities, backgrounds, and stories. Understanding who they were as men, not just as symbols, reveals the full depth of their achievement. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. commanded with an iron discipline that some found harsh, but that discipline was born from understanding what failure would mean. Every mistake would be attributed to race, not to individual error. Every success had to be undeniable. Davis rarely smiled, rarely showed emotion. Some thought him cold, but those who knew him understood the weight he carried. He wasn't just commanding a fighter group, he was defending his race against accusations of inferiority. Major George "Spanky" Roberts, one of the original Tuskegee Five, brought levity to the intensity. A talented pilot with a gift for mechanics, Roberts could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. He kept spirits up during the darkest training days, reminding men why they were there when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. "We're making history," Roberts would tell dejected cadets who'd failed a check ride. "History is hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it. Get back up there tomorrow and show them who you are." Captain Lemuel Custis, another of the original five, was the intellectual of the group. A college graduate who'd studied engineering, Custis understood aerodynamics at a theoretical level that translated into practical flying skill. He could explain why certain maneuvers worked, helping other pilots understand rather than just memorize. Custis survived the war and became an aerospace engineer, working on projects that benefited from the tactical knowledge he'd gained in combat. The transition from flying fighters to designing systems that would go to space seemed natural to him. "Flight is flight," he said in a 1975 interview. "Whether you're at 30,000 feet over Germany or planning missions to the moon, the principles are the same. You calculate, you prepare, you execute. The Tuskegee experience taught me that barriers are usually imaginary. Physics doesn't care about your skin color, neither does engineering." First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, who scored the 99th Squadron's first aerial victory, was quiet and methodical. He didn't seek glory, didn't boast about his achievement. When congratulated on his kill, he simply nodded and said, "Just doing my job." Hall's humility masked fierce determination. He'd grown up in Brazil, Indiana, where he was one of few black students in his school. He'd learned early to let performance speak louder than words. That philosophy served him throughout his military career. Captain Lee "Buddy" Archer, one of the group's top aces, was the opposite. Charismatic, confident, bordering on cocky. Archer loved flying with an infectious passion that energized everyone around him. He treated aerial combat like a deadly sport, respecting his opponents while thoroughly enjoying the competition. "I wasn't fighting because I hated Germans," Archer explained decades later. "I was fighting because I loved flying. The Germans just happened to be trying to kill my friends, which meant I had to stop them. But in the air, it was pure. Skill against skill, training against experience. I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it. Why pretend otherwise?" Archer's confidence occasionally irritated more reserved pilots, but no one questioned his ability. His 4 confirmed kills came during missions where his aggressive tactics, always within the framework of escort discipline, eliminated threats before they could reach the bombers. First Lieutenant Charles McGee exemplified quiet excellence. McGee flew more combat missions than almost any other Tuskegee Airman, 136 in World War II alone. He didn't have the most aerial victories, didn't lead the most dramatic missions, but he showed up every day and flew with precision and reliability. "Consistency matters," McGee often said. "Heroes die doing spectacular things. Professionals survive by doing ordinary things extraordinarily well. I wanted to be a professional." McGee's career spanning 3 wars demonstrated his philosophy. He flew P-51s in World War II, F-51s in Korea, and F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. Each war brought different challenges, different aircraft, different enemies. McGee adapted to all of them through disciplined preparation and execution. Second Lieutenant Robert Dees represented the tragedy of war. A talented pilot from Youngstown, Ohio, Dees flew 68 combat missions before being shot down over Austria in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. He survived the crash but was captured by retreating German forces. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts say he was murdered by German soldiers or civilians. Others suggest he died from wounds sustained in the crash. His body was recovered after the war, but the circumstances of his death were never definitively established. Dees's mother received a letter he'd written weeks before his death. "I'm not afraid of dying, Mom. I'm afraid of wasting my life. Every mission I fly, every bomber I protect, proves that our family, our people, our community deserves respect. If I die doing that, I die for something that matters." His funeral drew thousands in Youngstown, both black and white citizens mourning a local hero. The integrated attendance would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Captain Edward Gleed served as operations officer, responsible for planning missions and managing squadron logistics. While other pilots focused on flying, Gleed ensured they had fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and intelligence they needed. His organizational skills were exceptional, honed by necessity. Supply lines often shortchanged black units, requiring Gleed to negotiate, barter, and occasionally appropriate resources. He became expert at military bureaucracy, knowing which forms to file, which officers to approach, which channels to use. "Ed could get anything," one pilot recalled. "We'd be out of engine parts, mechanics saying we couldn't fly. 3 hours later, Gleed would show up with what we needed. Never asked where he got it. Didn't want to know. Just grateful he was on our side." Lieutenant Colonel George Spanky Roberts eventually commanded the 99th Fighter Squadron after Davis moved to Group Command. Roberts led by example, never asking pilots to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He flew the most dangerous missions, took the worst weather assignments, positioned himself as the most exposed target. "Leaders eat last," Roberts told junior officers. "You send your men into danger, you better be willing to go first. They need to know you won't waste their lives for glory or politics. Every mission I plan, I ask myself, is this worth dying for? If the answer is no, we don't fly." His leadership style created intense loyalty. Pilots would follow Roberts anywhere because they knew he valued their lives, not just their performance. The Tuskegee Airmen story isn't complete without acknowledging the ground crews, mechanics, armorers, and support personnel who kept the aircraft flying. These men, also black, also fighting segregation, received less recognition but were equally essential. Chief Master Sergeant James "Jet" Jackson led the maintenance operations for the 332nd. A former automotive mechanic from Detroit, Jackson understood engines at an instinctive level. He could hear problems in the engine note that instruments wouldn't detect for hours. Jackson's crew maintained the highest aircraft availability rate in the 15th Air Force. While other groups struggled to keep 60–70% of aircraft operational, the 332nd regularly achieved 85–90% availability. This meant more aircraft for missions, more flexibility in operations, more capability to protect bombers. How did they achieve this? Through improvisation, creativity, and relentless work ethic. Standard procedure called for replacing damaged parts with new ones from supply. But supply was often slow or incomplete for black units. Jackson's crew learned to rebuild components that should have been replaced, to fabricate parts from salvaged materials, to keep aircraft flying through mechanical ingenuity. "We couldn't afford to wait for supply to catch up," Jackson explained after the war. Pilots were flying combat missions. If their plane wasn't ready, someone else had to fly double missions, or the formation went up short. We took that personally. Our job was keeping them alive by keeping their planes working. The mechanics worked 16-hour days, often through the night before major missions. They maintained, repaired, modified, and improved aircraft under difficult conditions with limited resources. Sergeant Buford Johnson, an armorer responsible for the machine guns, developed modifications to the feed system that reduced jamming. The official technical manual specified one procedure. Johnson's practical experience suggested another. His modifications, technically unauthorized, improved reliability by 15%. When white technical officers from headquarters inspected the 332nd's aircraft and noticed the modifications, they initially threatened disciplinary action. Then they examined the reliability data, saw the improvement, and quietly adopted Johnson's modifications for other units without crediting the source. "That bothered me for years," Johnson said in a 1990 interview. "We solved problems, made things better, and someone else got credit. But eventually I realized the credit didn't matter. What mattered was that our pilots had reliable guns when they needed them. That kept them alive. That's the real victory." The ground crews also handled logistics, communications, intelligence, and administration. Every aspect of military operations required support personnel who were, like the pilots, overcoming prejudice while performing essential duties. Corporal William Thompson worked in intelligence, analyzing reconnaissance photos and preparing mission briefings. His photo interpretation skills were exceptional, spotting camouflaged targets and defensive positions that others missed. Thompson's briefings were detailed and accurate, giving pilots the information they needed to survive missions. He studied German tactics, identified patterns in their responses, predicted where flak batteries would be positioned based on target importance. "Intel is about keeping people alive," Thompson explained. "Every detail I get wrong could mean someone doesn't come home. That responsibility never left me. Even now, 70 years later, I remember faces of pilots I briefed, the ones who came back and the ones who didn't." The support personnel faced the same segregation as pilots, the same discrimination, the same pressure to perform flawlessly. They didn't get medals, didn't have combat records, didn't achieve aerial victories. But without them, none of the combat success would have been possible. While the overall combat record tells one story, specific missions reveal the character and capability of the Tuskegee Airmen in ways statistics cannot. The Anzio Rescue, January 27, 28, 1944. The 99th Fighter Squadron's breakout performance came during the Allied landings at Anzio. German forces counterattacked fiercely, and Luftwaffe fighters swarmed the beachhead trying to destroy landing craft and supply ships. For 2 days, the 99th flew continuous missions, often landing only to refuel and rearm before returning to combat. Pilots flew 4, sometimes 5 missions per day. Exhaustion blurred by adrenaline and necessity. Captain Clarence Jameson shot down 3 enemy fighters on January 27th alone. His gun camera footage showed precise deflection shooting, catching German fighters in vulnerable positions and destroying them with short, accurate bursts. But the real story was collective performance. The squadron destroyed 12 enemy aircraft over 2 days without losing a single pilot. They broke up German attack formations, protected vulnerable landing ships, and established air superiority over the beachhead at a critical moment. General John Cannon, commander of the 12th Air Force, visited the squadron after Anzio. His remarks were brief but significant. "You men have proven your courage and skill beyond any doubt. Well done." It wasn't effusive praise, but coming from Cannon, known for his reserved demeanor, it was powerful recognition. More importantly, it was shared with other units and higher command, helping dispel lingering doubts about black pilots' combat effectiveness. The Ploesti Mission, July 18, 1944. The Romanian oil fields at Ploesti were among the most heavily defended targets in Europe. German fighters, dense flak concentrations, and long-range missions to Ploesti were always costly. The 392nd Fighter Group escorted B-24 Liberators on a daylight raid to the refineries. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition. They were correct. Over 30 German fighters, a mix of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, intercepted the formation. The Red Tails met them 50 miles from target, engaging in a running battle that continued through the bomb run and initial withdrawal. Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester shot down 3 enemy fighters in this single mission, his most successful engagement of the war. His tactical approach demonstrated the value of training and discipline. Lester identified the German tactic: diving attacks from high altitude, trying to scatter the escort and create openings to reach the bombers. Instead of chasing diving fighters, Lester positioned himself where they'd have to climb back for altitude after their attack passes. German fighters diving at high speed were difficult targets, but climbing fighters, energy depleted, were vulnerable. Lester waited, let them dive past, then caught them as they struggled to regain altitude. 3 separate times, his patience paid off. Meanwhile, other Red Tail pilots maintained close escort, preventing German fighters from reaching the bombers. The coordination was precise, some fighters engaging threats, while others stayed glued to the bomber formation. All bombers returned safely. Several were damaged, some severely, but none were lost to fighter attack. The mission succeeded, the refineries were hit, and the 332nd's reputation grew. The strafing of Berlin-Tempelhof, April 1st, 1945. In the war's final weeks, the 332nd participated in increasingly aggressive operations deep into Germany. On April 1st, they escorted bombers to targets near Berlin, then received authorization for a ground strafing mission on the return flight. Berlin-Tempelhof Airfield, a Luftwaffe fighter base, was identified as the target. Strafing was among the most dangerous missions. Flying low made aircraft vulnerable to ground fire. Defenses could concentrate firepower, and pilots couldn't evade effectively at low altitude and high speed. Lieutenant Harry Stewart, Jr. led the flight of 4 P-51s that would conduct the attack. The mission required split-second timing, precise navigation, and courage that bordered on recklessness. Stewart's flight descended to treetop level, approaching the airfield at over 350 miles. German flak opened up immediately, filling the air with tracers and explosions. Stewart's aircraft was hit multiple times but remained airborne. The flight strafed parked aircraft, fuel dumps, and hangars. Gun camera footage showed their .50 caliber rounds tearing through German planes, igniting fuel, collapsing structures. In 2 passes lasting less than 90 seconds, they destroyed or damaged over a dozen enemy aircraft. All 4 P-51s survived, though 3 sustained significant damage. Stewart's aircraft had 13 holes from flak shrapnel. His wingman's engine was smoking and barely running. But they made it back to base in Italy. "That was the longest 90 seconds of my life," Stewart recalled. "Everything was fire and explosions. I couldn't believe we survived. But we destroyed their ability to launch fighters from that field. Worth it." The Me-262 encounters, March 24, 1945. The mission to Berlin that resulted in Captain Roscoe Brown shooting down an Me-262 jet deserves deeper examination because it demonstrated tactical brilliance under extraordinary circumstances. The 332nd was escorting bombers to a tank factory outside Berlin, a 1,600-mile round trip that pushed the P-51's range to its limit. Every pilot knew they'd have minimal fuel for combat, making any engagement risky. When 3 Me-262s appeared, diving toward the bomber formation at over 500 mph, most escorts would have been helpless. The jets were too fast to intercept in a stern chase, too quick to catch in a dive. But Brown had studied Me-262 tactics from intelligence reports and gun camera footage. He knew the jets' weaknesses. They had to slow down to attack effectively. Their turning radius was wide at high speed, and their engines were fragile when throttled rapidly. Brown positioned himself not behind the jets, where they'd outrun him, but between them and the bombers, forcing them to turn to engage their targets. As one jet banked, bleeding energy in the turn, Brown pulled his Mustang into a maximum G-turn that probably exceeded the aircraft's rated limits. For a few seconds, as the jet's speed dropped in the turn and Brown's Mustang held maximum velocity, they were matched. Brown fired, his .50 calibers shredding the jet's left engine and fuselage. The Me-262 entered an uncontrollable spin and crashed. Lieutenant Earl Lane and Lieutenant Charles Brantley achieved similar victories that day using comparable tactics. The 3 red-tail pilots had done what most considered impossible, and they'd done it while protecting their bombers. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had compiled an extraordinary combat record, but victory brought new uncertainty. What would happen to these men in peacetime? The military began demobilizing rapidly. Millions of servicemen returned home, overwhelming civilian infrastructure. The transition was chaotic for everyone, but particularly difficult for black veterans. The GI Bill, which provided education benefits, home loans, and job training to veterans, was theoretically colorblind. In practice, Southern states implemented it in ways that excluded or limited black veterans' access. Black veterans applying for home loans were often denied, told the neighborhoods they wanted to live in didn't qualify, or that they didn't meet credit standards white veterans passed easily. Educational benefits were limited by which schools would admit black students. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson returned to Detroit planning to use his GI Bill benefits for college. He applied to several universities with strong engineering programs. Most rejected him outright. Those that accepted him suggested he might be more comfortable at historically black colleges. "I'd flown combat missions over Germany," Jefferson said bitterly. "I'd been a prisoner of war. I'd earned a Distinguished Flying Cross. But I wasn't good enough for white universities in my own country." The disconnect between military service and civilian treatment radicalized many Tuskegee veterans. They'd fought for freedom abroad. Now they demanded it at home. Some veterans joined the NAACP, participating in legal challenges to segregation. Others worked with local civil rights organizations, applying military organizational skills to civilian activism. A few entered politics, running for office and winning, though progress was slow. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. remained in the military, one of the few Tuskegee Airmen to make it a career. The decision was pragmatic. The military, for all its flaws, was beginning to integrate. Civilian America remained deeply segregated. Davis commanded the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing in Korea, flew over 200 combat missions, and continued rising through the ranks. In 1954, he became the first black general in the United States Air Force. His promotion was both personal achievement and symbolic milestone. "I didn't stay in the military for glory," Davis said years later. "I stayed because the fight wasn't over. Integration was happening, but slowly. Someone had to keep pushing, keep proving that black officers could perform at any level. I had the position and the record to do that." Charles McGee also continued serving, flying combat in Korea and Vietnam. His career demonstrated that the Tuskegee Airmen weren't anomalies, but representatives of broader capability that had been suppressed by discrimination. Other veterans returned to civilian life and excelled in various fields. Several became doctors, leveraging GI Bill benefits despite obstacles. Others became educators, lawyers, businessmen, engineers. What united them was the determination to succeed, to prove that their wartime performance wasn't exceptional, but representative of what Black Americans could achieve with opportunity.